You're about to hear 44 predictions made by presidents, CEOs, legendary scientists, and the smartest men alive who confidently declared entire industries impossible. Airplanes, computers, smartphones, space travel. They didn't hesitate, they didn't doubt. They were absolutely sure. And they were spectacularly wrong. Every single one aged like milk under a spotlight. 1. In 1876, William Orton, the president of Western Union, had the chance to buy the patent for the telephone for a measly $100,000. Instead of shaking hands on the deal of the millennium, he laughed in Alexander Graham Bell's face. Orton wrote a memo describing the telephone as an electrical toy and confidently stated that this device has inherently no value to us. He genuinely believed that people would prefer tapping out Morse code dots and dashes rather than, actually talking to each other. While Bell's invention went on to shrink the world and create a trillion-dollar industry, Western Union spent the next century slowly realizing that an electrical toy was worth more than their entire company. 2. Doctors in the 19th century were apparently terrified of women having fun, so they invented a fake medical condition called bicycle face. In the 1890s, medical journals seriously warned that riding a bicycle would give women bulging eyes and a permanently clenched jaw, making them look terrifyingly ugly. They claimed the stress of balancing on two wheels would ruin a lady's complexion forever. It is hilarious that they thought the female face was so fragile, it would shatter if it moved faster than a brisk walk. Thankfully, women ignored these dusty old men, kept pedaling, and somehow managed to not turn into gargoyles. 3. Lord Kelvin was the president of the Royal Society and arguably the smartest physicist of the Victorian era. But he had a massive blind spot when it came to aviation. In 1895, he didn't just express doubt, he slammed the gavel down on the entire concept of flight. He famously declared that heavier-than-air flying machines are impossible. He wasn't suggesting it would be difficult. He was saying the laws of physics forbade it. He died in 1907, which is incredibly awkward because the Wright brothers had already flown their plane at Kitty Hawk 4 years earlier. Imagine being the world's leading scientist and getting proven wrong by two bicycle mechanics from Ohio who just didn't know it was impossible. 4. For centuries, the smartest scientists on Earth believed that mice were not born from other mice, but were magically created from dirty laundry. It was called spontaneous generation. Recipes for creating mice included putting a sweaty shirt and some wheat in a dark corner and waiting 21 days. They genuinely believed that the sweat interacted with the wheat to morph into a living, breathing rodent. It is mind-blowing that grown men with degrees thought that leaving your underwear on the floor was a biological experiment, rather than just being messy. 5. The New York Times is usually a pillar of serious journalism, but in 1920, they decided to roast rocket scientist Robert Goddard. When Goddard proposed that rockets could work in the vacuum of space to reach the moon, the Times published a scathing editorial mocking him. They claimed a rocket couldn't function without air to push against, and accused Goddard of lacking the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. They literally used high school physics to try and dunk on a rocket scientist. 49 years later, as Apollo 11 hurtled toward the moon using the exact physics Goddard described, the Times quietly issued a retraction, admitting that rockets do, in fact, work in a vacuum. A little late, guys. 6. In 1748, the French Parliament was so terrified of the humble potato that they actually made it illegal to grow them. Their top scientists were absolutely convinced that potatoes caused leprosy. Yes, you heard that right. They looked at a lumpy brown vegetable and decided it was a biological weapon that would make your skin fall off. For decades, the French were starving while refusing to eat the one thing that could save them because they thought it was a one-way ticket to a leper colony. It took a guy named Parmentier getting captured by Prussians and forced to eat spuds to realize that fries are actually delicious and don't cause flesh-eating diseases. 7. Hollywood moguls are supposed to know what audiences want, but Harry Warner of Warner Brothers missed the mark by a mile in 1927. When pitched the revolutionary idea of movies with synchronized sound, he didn't see dollar signs. He saw disaster. He furiously shouted at his staff, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" He was convinced that the magic of cinema was in the silence and the music, and that dialogue would ruin everything. Of course, The Jazz Singer was released that same year, talkies took over the world, and silent films went extinct almost overnight. It turns out, Harry, that people actually really like hearing what the actors are saying. 8. Back in the early days of steam power, smart people were terrified of speed. In the early 19th century, Dr. Dionysius Lardner, a man who was essentially the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day, warned the public about the dangers of high-speed trains. He declared with absolute medical certainty that rail travel at high speed is not possible because passengers, unable to breathe, would die of asphyxia. He believed that if you traveled faster than 20 miles per hour, the air would be sucked out of your lungs and you would suffocate in your seat. It is a miracle that humanity ever invented the roller coaster, considering our top scientists thought a brisk jog might kill us. 9. The president of the Michigan Savings Bank in 1903 gave perhaps the worst investment advice since someone bought a ticket for the Titanic. He advised Henry Ford's lawyer, Horace Rackham, not to invest in the Ford Motor Company because, and I quote, "The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty." Imagine looking at a horse, an animal that requires food, sleep, and leaves massive piles of manure everywhere it goes, and thinking that is the peak of transportation efficiency. He truly believed we would be dodging horse piles in the streets forever instead of cruising in climate-controlled metal boxes. Thankfully, Rackham ignored him and became a millionaire, while the banker probably spent his life wondering why his stable stocks were plummeting. 10. Even Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park himself, was capable of being spectacularly wrong when his ego was involved. He was in a bitter rivalry with George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla over electricity standards, and Edison was convinced that alternating current, or AC, was a disaster waiting to happen. He stated that fooling around with alternating current is just a waste of time because nobody will use it, ever. He was so confident that direct current was the future that he ignored the fact that AC could actually travel long distances without fizzling out. It turns out that the entire planet prefers the electricity that actually works over long distances, leaving Edison to eat his words in the dark. 11. We think of the tank as a terrifying beast of war, but the British War Office initially thought it was a joke. When the first tank designs were presented during World War I, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, inspected the prototype and called it a pretty mechanical toy. He confidently stated that the tank would never be a serious weapon because it would be too easy to destroy with artillery. He looked at a literal armored fortress on treads and treated it like a wind-up toy soldier. A few years later, those toys were rolling over trenches and changing warfare forever, proving that Lord Kitchener should have stuck to pointing at people on recruitment posters. 12. If you think business moguls are bad, wait until you hear about the music industry executives who were functionally deaf. In 1962, Decca Records auditioned a scrappy little band from Liverpool and decided to pass on them. The executive, Dick Rowe, famously told the band's manager that guitar groups are on the way out and the boys have no future in show business. That band was the Beatles. Instead of the Fab Four, Decca signed a group called the Tremolos, who are famous for, well, absolutely nothing. This goes down as the single biggest mistake in music history, proving that wearing a suit doesn't mean you know what cool sounds like. 13. Napoleon Bonaparte was a military genius, but when it came to steam power, he was about as forward-thinking as a brick wall. When the American inventor Robert Fulton presented his idea for a steamship to the French emperor in the early 1800s, Napoleon dismissed him immediately. He reportedly called Fulton a charlatan and banished him from his sight. Napoleon could have had a fleet of ships that did not need wind to move, which might have come in handy when he was trying to invade England. Instead, he stuck with sails and ended up on an island in the middle of nowhere, probably wishing he had listened to the guy with the loud, smoking boat. 14. Thomas Watson, the president of IBM in 1943, made a prediction about computers that makes him look like he was trying to sell abacuses. He famously said, "I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers." 5? Not 5 million, just 5. He seemingly thought that maybe the Pentagon would want one, the president would want one, and perhaps a couple of eccentric billionaires would use them as really expensive paperweights. To be fair, computers back then were the size of a house and cost as much as a battleship. But limiting the entire global market to the number of fingers on one hand is a special kind of pessimism. Today, my toaster has more computing power than Watson thought the whole world needed. 15. For over 200 years, European aristocrats were convinced that the tomato was a lethal weapon disguised as a snack. They nicknamed it the poison apple because wealthy people would eat off pewter plates. The acid in the tomato would leach lead from the plate, and they would drop dead. Instead of blaming the toxic metal plates, they blamed the innocent red fruit. It is mind-blowing that for centuries, people were starving while looking at fields of delicious tomatoes, thinking one bite would send them to the grave. It took a brave guy eating a basket of them on a courthouse steps in New Jersey to prove they were just delicious, not deadly. 16. When Thomas Edison unveiled the light bulb, you would think the British Parliament would be impressed, but they were too busy sniffing their own skepticism. In 1878, a British parliamentary committee investigated the electric light and concluded that it was good enough for our transatlantic friends, but unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men. They essentially called the light bulb a cute American toy for people who do not appreciate the manly art of squinting in the dark. They were convinced that gas lamps, which smelled like rotten eggs and occasionally exploded, were the pinnacle of illumination technology. It is truly amazing how smart people can look at a literal glowing miracle and decide it is just a passing fad. 17. Marshal Ferdinand Foch was a brilliant French military commander during World War I, but his vision of the future was stuck in the era of muskets. In 1911, he watched an air show and dismissively remarked that airplanes are interesting toys but of no military value. He looked at a machine that could fly over enemy lines and drop bombs and thought, "Nah, give me a horse any day." It is terrifying that the guy in charge of national defense thought the Air Force was just a carnival attraction. History proved him wrong almost immediately, as planes became the most terrifying weapon in the sky. 18. In the late 19th century, respected scientists genuinely believed that women's brains would shrink if they pursued higher education. Doctors warned that studying too hard would damage reproductive organs and cause permanent hysteria. Apparently, algebra was more dangerous than childbirth. Universities were hesitant to admit women because they feared classrooms would become medical emergency rooms. Fast forward to today, where women outperform men in college enrollment. Turns out the brain doesn't shrink from knowledge, but outdated thinking absolutely does. 19. In 1959, IBM had the chance to buy the technology behind the Xerox photocopier, but they blew it because they loved carbon paper too much. They hired a consulting firm to analyze the market, and the geniuses concluded that the photocopier had no future because carbon paper was cheap and sufficient. They thought nobody would pay for a machine to copy documents when you could just messily type it out twice. IBM passed on the deal, and Xerox went on to become a verb and a billion-dollar empire. IBM's consultants basically looked at a printing press for every office and said, "No thanks, we prefer smudgy fingers." 20. Television is the centerpiece of every living room today. But in 1946, Darryl Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, thought it was a total snooze fest. He confidently predicted that television won't be able to hold on to any market it captures after the first 6 months. His reasoning was that people would soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. This man ran a movie studio, yet he could not conceive that people might enjoy watching moving pictures without leaving their house to buy overpriced popcorn. He thought we would all just go back to staring at the wall or listening to the radio once the novelty wore off. Talk about betting against human laziness. 21. When gas lighting was first introduced to British cities in the early 19th century, the public reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. People actually believed that the gas traveled through the pipes on fire. They were terrified to touch the light fixtures because they thought they would burn their hands on the pipes even if the light was off. wealthy homeowners would frantically ask if the fire inside the pipe would explode their walls. It is hilarious to imagine Victorian gentlemen gingerly poking a cold metal pipe with a stick, terrified that a dragon was living inside their plumbing. It took years of education to convince them that gas is invisible, not a liquid fire snake. 22. When the idea of radio broadcasting was pitched in the 1920s, investors looked at it like it was a magic trick with no payout. The associates of David Sarnoff, a radio pioneer, urged him not to invest in what they called the radio music box. They asked with genuine confusion, who would pay for a message sent to nobody in particular? They could not wrap their heads around the concept of broadcasting. They thought if you weren't sending a message to a specific person, like a telegram, it was just useless noise. They missed the fact that millions of people would happily listen to that noise for free if you just played some catchy tunes and sold some soap in between. 23. If you hate traffic laws today, just be glad you didn't drive in Britain in 1865. The government passed the Red Flag Act, which stated that self-propelled vehicles could not travel faster than 4 miles per hour in the country and 2 miles per hour in the city. But the real kicker? A man carrying a red flag had to walk 60 yards in front of the car to warn everyone of the approaching mechanical demon. Imagine buying a sports car and being legally required to drive at the speed of a slow toddler while your buddy walks ahead of you waving a piece of fabric. It was the ultimate buzzkill for the entire concept of horsepower. 24. We now know that radiation is bad news, but in the early 20th century, people were chugging it like it was Gatorade. When radium was discovered, entrepreneurs immediately started selling it as a miracle cure for everything from arthritis to impotence. They sold radioactive water, radioactive chocolate, and even radioactive toothpaste to make your smile literally glow. The logic was that since it had energy, it must give you energy. It is horrifyingly hilarious that people were paying top dollar to slowly poison themselves, thinking they were drinking the elixir of life. The only thing that ended up glowing was their tombstones. 25. The British Admiralty in the mid-19th century had a very simple, very wrong understanding of physics: wood floats, iron sinks. When the idea of building warships out of iron was proposed to the First Lord of the Admiralty, he looked at the engineers like they were insane. He famously argued that since a lump of iron sinks, an iron ship would obviously plummet to the bottom of the ocean. He completely ignored the concept of displacement, which is literally the first thing you learn in boat school. They were ready to send sailors out in wooden targets because they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that heavy metal can actually float if you shape it like a boat. 26. Edwin Drake is the father of the oil industry, but in 1859 everyone called him a lunatic for trying to drill for it. Before Drake, people just collected oil that seeped out of the ground with rags. When he proposed drilling into the earth like you would for water, the locals mocked him mercilessly, calling the project Drake's Folly. They would stand around the rig and laugh, asking him if he planned to drink the oil when he found it. They thought the idea of pumping black sludge from the depths was the dumbest waste of time imaginable. Joke's on them, because Drake struck black gold and changed the entire world while they were still dipping rags in puddles. 27. Ignaz Semmelweis is a hero today, but in the 1840s, he was the most hated man in medicine for suggesting that doctors should wash their hands. When he realized that doctors were carrying deadly particles from the morgue to the maternity ward, he told them to scrub up. The medical community was offended. They argued that gentlemen's hands are naturally clean and that his theory was an insult to their social status. They were literally killing patients with their dirty ego, refusing to use a little chlorine in water because they thought being a gentleman was a magical shield against bacteria. 28. In 2007, when Apple unveiled the first iPhone, Microsoft's CEO Steve Ballmer laughed on camera. He mocked the price, mocked the lack of a physical keyboard, and confidently predicted it would never gain significant market share. He looked directly at the future of computing and started chuckling. Today, the smartphone industry is worth hundreds of billions, and physical keyboards are basically museum artifacts. Somewhere out there, that laugh is still echoing through history like a warning siren. 29. In 1975, a young engineer at Kodak built the world's first digital camera. Instead of celebrating him, executives basically told him to bury it. They were terrified it would kill their film business, so they locked the invention in a drawer like it was radioactive. Kodak dominated photography for a century, then got erased by the very technology they refused to embrace. They literally invented the future and said, "Nah, we're good." That's not a missed opportunity, that's corporate self-sabotage at Olympic level. 30. Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, revolutionized global logistics, but his college professor thought he was an idiot. When Smith wrote a paper at Yale proposing an overnight delivery service for the computer age, his professor gave him a C grade. The professor wrote that while the concept is interesting and well-formed, in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. He literally told the future billionaire that delivering packages quickly was impossible because of reasons? It is the ultimate academic facepalm. Smith framed that C grade and built a $50 billion company just to prove that professor wrong. 31. Charlie Chaplin was the king of comedy and the biggest star on the planet, but his ability to predict the future of his own industry was laughably bad. In 1916, right at the height of his fame, he told a reporter that the cinema is little more than a fad. He confidently predicted that audiences would get bored of canned drama and go back to watching live theater. He thought the idea of people sitting in a dark room watching a screen was just a passing trend, like pet rocks or fidget spinners. It is hilarious that the man who defined the movies didn't actually believe they would last longer than a carton of milk. 32. We treat aluminum foil like trash today, wrapping our leftovers in it and throwing it away, but in the mid-19th century, it was the ultimate flex. Emperor Napoleon III of France was so obsessed with aluminum that he considered it more precious than gold. At his fancy dinner parties, the honored guests were given aluminum cutlery, while the peasants had to eat with gold forks. He essentially treated the stuff we use to make soda cans like it was vibranium. It is hysterical to think of an emperor showing off his wealth by waving around a metal that we now use to bake potatoes. 33. In 1977, Ken Olsen, the founder of Digital Equipment Corporation, looked at the future of technology and shrugged. He famously stated that there is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. He thought computers were strictly for tracking payrolls or launching missiles, not for playing solitaire or arguing with strangers on the internet. He was a tech billionaire who couldn't conceive of a world where people might want to type a document without a typewriter. Today, I have more computing power in my refrigerator than Olsen thought the entire consumer market would ever need. 34. You can't talk about bad predictions without mentioning the White Star Line and their floating palace, the Titanic. In 1912, a vice president of the company was so drunk on hubris that he publicly declared, "We place absolute confidence in the Titanic. We believe that the ship is unsinkable." Crew members were even heard telling passengers that God himself could not sink this ship. They were so sure of their engineering genius that they didn't bother packing enough lifeboats, treating safety regulations like optional suggestions. History promptly responded with an iceberg, proving that Mother Nature really hates it when you brag. 35. H.G. Wells was a science fiction legend who wrote about time machines and alien invasions, but apparently, submarines were too crazy for him. In 1901, he wrote that he must confess that his imagination refuses to see any sort of submarine doing anything but suffocating its crew and floundering at sea. The man who invented the concept of a War of the Worlds could not imagine a boat that goes underwater without killing everyone on board. It is hilarious that he could visualize Martians with heat rays destroying cities, but a metal tube that sinks on purpose and comes back up was just pure fantasy to him. Naval warfare history would like a word with you, Mr. Wells. 36. In 2000, Netflix offered to sell itself to Blockbuster for $50 million. Blockbuster executives listened politely, then declined. They thought mailing DVDs was a niche gimmick and streaming sounded ridiculous. At the time, Blockbuster had 9,000 stores and absolute dominance. A decade later, Netflix was a global powerhouse, and Blockbuster was a nostalgic memory with late fees. Imagine being offered the future for pocket change and saying, "We're good." That's not bad business. That's legendary denial. 37. Before we knew what germs were, the smartest doctors in London believed that cholera was caused by miasma, or bad smells. In the 1850s, when Dr. John Snow suggested that maybe, just maybe, the disease was in the dirty drinking water, the authorities mocked him. They were convinced that the smell of the Thames River was the problem, so they spent millions improving airflow while ignoring the fact that the water pump was the issue. They looked at a guy holding a map of infected water pumps and said, "No thanks, we'll stick to sniffing the air." 38. Percival Lowell was a wealthy astronomer who spent years staring at Mars, and he was absolutely convinced he saw a civilization. In the early 20th century, he published books claiming that the lines on Mars were giant canals built by Martians to transport water from the poles. He mapped out cities, oases, and trade routes, creating an entire alien world in his head. The public went wild, terrified of a Martian invasion. It turns out, his telescope was just blurry, and he was essentially connecting the dots on a smudged lens. There were no aliens, just a guy with an overactive imagination and a dirty telescope. 39. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he was weirdly stubborn about rocks falling from the sky. In 1807, when two professors from Yale reported seeing a meteorite crash in Connecticut, Jefferson essentially called them liars. He famously said, "I would rather believe that two Yankee professors would lie than that stones would fall from heaven." The President of the United States decided that gravity and space rocks were fake news because he just couldn't wrap his head around the concept. I guess it is easier to build a nation than to admit the sky is falling. 40. Before 1901, cleaning your house was a great way to choke to death. Early vacuum cleaners didn't suck. They blew compressed air to blast dust off the carpet. It didn't clean anything. It just moved the dirt from the floor into your lungs. When Hubert Booth suggested that maybe the machine should suck the dirt into a bag, engineers laughed at him. Booth had to demonstrate by putting a handkerchief on a chair and sucking the dust through it with his own mouth, nearly choking himself just to prove that sucking was better than blowing. Talk about a dusty way to prove a point. 41. In the 1940s, your doctor didn't tell you to quit smoking. He probably lit one up for you. Medical journals were stuffed with ads claiming that Camels are the cigarette that doctors smoke most. They actually believed that smoking helped clear the lungs and soothe the throat. Imagine walking into a clinic with a hacking cough, and the guy in the white coat prescribes a pack of unfiltered cigarettes to open up your airways. It is the medical equivalent of trying to put out a house fire with a bucket of gasoline. 42. Alfred Wegener is the guy who realized that the continents fit together like a puzzle, but in 1912, geologists treated him like he was insane. When he proposed the theory of continental drift, the scientific community mocked him relentlessly. They asked if the continents had little legs to walk on. They preferred to believe that land bridges just magically sank into the ocean rather than accept that the ground moves. Poor Wegener died a joke, and it took 50 years for everyone to look at a map, see that South America fits perfectly into Africa, and say, "Oh wait, he was right." 43. When the table fork was introduced to Europe from the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century, the church lost its mind. They declared the fork to be an insult to God. St. Peter Damian preached that God provided us with natural forks, our fingers, and using a metal tool to eat was a sign of vanity and sin. They actually believed that spearing your meat with a fork was a one-way ticket to hell. It is hilarious to think that for hundreds of years, people were eating with their hands not because they lacked cutlery, but because they were afraid a salad fork would damn their souls. 44. Let's end with the guy who tried to cancel physics. In 1894, Albert Michelson, a wildly respected physicist, declared that the most important fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered. He basically told the world, "We're done here, folks, go home." He thought the future of science was just measuring things a little more accurately. He said this right before Einstein dropped the theory of relativity. Quantum mechanics was born, and we split the atom. It is the ultimate mic drop moment that backfired, proving that the moment you think you know everything, the universe will invent a black hole just to make you look stupid. 44 moments where confidence lost to reality. Now here's the part that matters. Which disastrous prediction did we miss? What modern, obvious truth do you think will age horribly next? Name it. Defend it. Put your reputation in the comments. Like the video if at least one expert made you feel smarter than them. Subscribe. History loves receipts.